Hey everybody, and welcome to Real Supernatural Encounters. Today, I do not have any eyewitnesses, but I figured I'd go ahead and do a 3-story mashup, which means from all the stories that people send me, I'm going to pick 3 random ones and read them off to you guys. And these are all true supernatural encounters. So if you guys are ready, let's get started. So for the first one, this is from Reddit user A Little Ways Away. And this title is called A Shadow Person Followed Me Back to My Room. When I was around 10 years old, I lived with my dad and his new wife part-time. I woke up one morning around 5 a.m. and walked out to the living room after hearing a repetitive noise, thinking it was my stepmom, who often had problems sleeping, which resulted in her waking up early or staying up late. When I walked into the living room, I saw a shadow in the kitchen, making a noise that sounded like a spoon hitting the side of an empty bowl. I don't know why, but I figured it was my stepmom making pudding. I stared for a while and thought it was weird that she was doing this without the lights on. And even weirder, that the more I stared at her, the more I realized that I wasn't able to make out any of her features. I remember thinking she looked like she was made up of the colors you see when you close your eyes. After staring for a while and trying to make out what I saw, I called out to her, and the mixing sound stopped. I stood and stared a little longer before I realized that it wasn't my stepmom in the kitchen. I ran back to my room and covered my head with my blanket, not daring to close my door because my parents kept bells on their door and they would have made too much noise. After hiding under my covers for a few moments and trying to convince myself that it was nothing, I decided to peek out. To my horror, I saw the same shadow figure walk into my doorway. I hid myself back under the covers and hyperventilated until I fell asleep. When I woke up in the morning, I asked my stepmom if she was awake and in the kitchen earlier, which she denied and was confused. I ended up telling my mom about it when she picked me up, and to this day she teases me about it, the mixing bowl ghost. I always thought it was a ghost until I saw someone mention shadow people in the subreddit. So that's that for that story. And that's pretty scary too. Imagine going into the kitchen and late at night and thinking you're seeing your mom, but you're not, and you can't even make out the features on her face, just for the mixing of the bowl to stop. He thinks it could have been a shadow person, but sometimes there's these things called doppelgangers, and they only appear when someone's going to die, but it's like a mirage of yourself, or a mirage of a person you know, and they come and they go. I have some other theories on that one too, but that's pretty scary. Now, for the next one. Alright, we're going to do, it's called Bear and Dogman Encounter. This is from Reddit user Corvasaurus428. And the title is, like I said, Bear and Dogman Interaction. It's not too often one reports seeing or having indications of a cryptid with a normal animal. If they are believed to be real, however, humans can't be the only things they interact with. Not every animal out there is vulnerable. This was not a report I myself witnessed, but instead one my grandfather told me about that my aunt later collaborated independently, so I think they're trustworthy. At this time, I'll note there wasn't much talk of Dogman, as this was about a decade before the infamous song came out. Though there was talk of wolves or werewolf-like monsters in Appalachia for a long time, so my aunt and my grandmother just always called it the wolf thing creature. For a little background, my grandparents' currently aunt's home is in the backwoods of western Grayson County, Virginia, which to this day is still sparsely populated outside of one of two large towns on the east side, and back then it was even less so. Extremely thick forest with hilly terrain in all directions. You have to get on a dirt path and follow it for about half a mile to get to a gravel-covered side road, and then follow it for about 30 minutes to reach a very small town just across the North Carolina border. If you go a short ways north, you'll find yourself at the Blue Ridge Mountains and Parkway that lead up into Appalachia proper. The forest is mostly low-lying shrubs up to around 4 feet high, with pine and a lot of black oak trees making up a canopy. There is a very clear stream about 30 yards from the house, which has fish quite frequently. This, along with the wild blackberries, tenderleaf, shrubs, and some apple trees, make it very lucrative for wildlife. The house itself is in an old 2-story house built onto an incline of a hill that overlooks it. This was back in the 1970s. My aunt believes it was 1978, as she was finishing high school at the time. My father had graduated from college and was going up to the Air Force, so he had already moved out. My grandfather, although he was old enough to retire, liked to remain busy, so he worked his old job as the electrician and power pole technician, just now in an advisory role because he was getting up there in years. He had just gotten the contract down in North Carolina, so he was away from the house for about a week and a half. This left only my 17-year-old aunt and grandmother at the house. As I said, there usually was a lot of wildlife in the area. A typical morning for my grandmother was making breakfast and sitting out on her porch watching deer and rabbits eat at the shrubs. Sometimes she would also see or hear a bobcat, fox, or coyote about. On one occasion, a mountain lion and her cubs strolled right past the house. One animal she was familiar with in particular was a very large black bear who could be recognized by folks around those parts from a white patch on his chest and a hole in his left ear. My grandmother nicknamed him Captain because he had a habit of sitting on his haunches and reaching up with his paws to pick apples. A motion that looked like he was saluting Captain was very big black bear, but wasn't very aggressive unless tested. He seemed to have an agreement with my grandmother and grandfather that if they left him alone, he would leave them alone. He just strolled by the house every now and then to have some blackberries on the bushes or apples that had fallen down, which meant he came by the house's yard often, as he was too big to climb trees, much more than fruit trees around the house were low enough he could reach up and pick food. My grandfather estimated he was somewhere in the 500 to 600 pound range and roughly 6 feet tall, as the grandfather once measured some scratch marks he left on a tree. During the week, my grandmother noticed a fairly sharp decline in the animals nearby. It was the later part of summer, and a wet season, so most of the plants were full bloom, and the leaves were at their tenderest. Yet she couldn't see hide nor hair of any rabbits or deer coming to graze. A coyote she had heard yapping every night for the past month seemed to vanish. A few neighbors, by neighbors I mean people who lived within 5 miles, who stopped by, told her something had taken their dog and their chicken coop and been smashed into. They assumed that the mountain lion that lurked around had done it, since it was the only other thing that could have feasibly taken down a large farm dog, as they had seen Captain, which is the bear creature, that only other predator nearby, big enough to take down an 80-pound farm dog, the day after in a completely different area, gorging himself on a dead deer. They checked around and couldn't find anything. The next night, my grandmother was woken up by my aunt, who told her that she heard something bang against the outside of her wall. They checked around in the morning after and found one of the deer butchered with a bloody smear on the wall. Judging from the way The gravel was disturbed. The deer had been walking by the house when something ambushed it, and then, in a struggle, it got smashed against the wall. My grandmother, having grown up in the woods, was familiar with predator kills and methods. Mountain lions tend to jump on the back and rake their claws across the flanks to hold on as they bite the neck. Black bears will usually break the neck or the back with their paws while biting the head. And the rare occasion coyotes attack deer, they usually do it by biting down on its inside of the leg and twisting to rip the muscle and arteries. This kill clearly had the throat ripped out, but there weren't any claw marks to be found, and the bite looked narrower than what a cougar would do. Plus, she could gander there was only one predator from the way the ground had been disturbed, which didn't make sense for coyotes as they typically hunted in pairs, since just one alone isn't usually enough to bring down a full-grown deer. After disposing of the carcass, the next few nights were relatively uneventful, except for the fact several times my aunt or grandmother would be woken up in the middle of the night by the sound of something panting outside. Now, in these woods, you can hear a pin drop. If it's close enough, and at some points, they could swear the animal making the panting was directly outside the wall. One day, my grandmother was picking some berries when she noticed what looked like a dog tracks of a very large hound going through a mud flat bordering the nearby stream. Thinking it might be the missing farm dog who had maybe just ran away, she followed the tracks until she heard something loudly growling at her from across the stream. She looked up to see the partially obscured face of what looked like on large, bulky, brown-colored coyote or wolf standing in a thicket on the other side of the stream. She quickly began to back away, glancing back only to check her footing on the slope that led down the stream. When she looked back, she saw the very distinctly canine face in much greater detail because the animal had moved out from under cover. But instead of stepping out of the leaves like she thought it did at first, she soon noticed that it was instead standing up on its hind legs and peering over the shrubs. Now she had seen canines stand upright before. Dogs do it, foxes can do it, coyotes sometimes do it. It was the size that took her off guard. She had been to the exact same thicket of shrubs just the other day, and her head only just barely reached the top, and my grandmother was only around 5'3". This thing had its head pitched clear over the shrubs with a little bit of extra visible, and usually when a predator is making no attempt to hide, it's usually because it's trying to intimidate someone. My grandmother managed to back away to the hill without turning around, and when she started to get out of sight, the creature stepped out of the thicket on its hind legs. It strolled forward in a very uncanny way. She had trouble describing, but she insisted it never went back down on all fours. Needless to say, she ran to the house in a backpedal sprint. That night, they heard the panting again, along with a distant howl and scraping sounds. They found the garage door, back door frame, and kitchen window frame all had claw marks on them from something investigating them. The canine creature was seen a few more times across the week by my grandmother and the neighbors, usually on or near the area of my family's property. My aunt finally saw it when she saw a pair of fuzzy ears outside her window. Now, she wasn't startled right off the bat from this, as Captain had come by her window a few times before, and she gradually lost some of fear of the big bear over the years. But in this case, his ears just barely reached the edge of the windowsill, whereas in this case, you could clearly see them in the top of their owner's head. She quickly realized it wasn't the bear because of the pointed shape, brown coloring, and the fact it had two fully intact ears. They also started to detect a very pungent smell on a side door porch, one time finding what looked like some urinal or some other liquid stains on it, suggesting an animal had scent marked it to claim the spot. It all came to a head on Wednesday night when they heard howling in the distance grow closer. My grandmother flipped on a porch light and glimpsed the canine animal quickly sprinting across the lawn on its hind legs again. Her sighting confirmed how big it was. She'd seen timber wolves at the zoo up to 150 pounds, and she was certain this was at least a bit more than twice that size. For several hours of that night, they could hear it roaming around the property and pressing against doors like it was trying to find a way in. They glimpsed at several points eyeshine of yellow eyes peering in through the windows, as well as broad, long-fingered paws being pushed against the glass briefly. This was the day and age before cell phones and 24-hour police service in some rural areas, so no one had a means of immediately calling the police. Instead, my grandmother had to wait arduous minutes on a dial line with the connection difficulty trying to call the police station 2 towns over. She was distracted by my aunt screaming, running into a bedroom to get one of the guns out. She had been sitting in the living room when she felt clicking against the glass and saw that wolf thing pressing its face and bare teeth against the surface. With its claws fully outstretched, both of them started to try to get the rifles or shotguns out. It was becoming increasingly clear that the creature was trying to get into the house and knew they were in there. They heard it panting through a wall before there was sound of heavy footsteps and a very loud thump with a flash of fur on the edge of the window. They ran into the innermost room, the pantry locker, and stayed in there with the guns. Now it's not like in the movies, wherein creatures roar, snarl, and hiss constantly no matter what they're doing. But they did hear a commotion outside. My aunt and grandmother hadn't the faintest idea what was going on and didn't investigate until the morning after. But they could tell something was antagonizing something, as occasional grunts, barks, and rumbles were audible through the blackness for about a minute and gradually moved off. They found no bodies, but there had clearly been a ferocious altercation. The ground was ripped up in multiple spots. The wall had a dent in it, and there was some oxidized blood traces on the grass and dirt. My grandmother also found a trail where something had charged through the shrubs and recovered several vague dog prints, as well as wider tracks moving the same direction. The animals all seemed to come back by the end of the week, and the howls stopped. When my grandfather came back home, he and my aunt and some neighbors surveyed the area to make sure they couldn't find the wolf creature. Evidently, the neighbors had also heard howls around their property at night that stopped recently too. They couldn't find it despite surveying the whole property, though they did find what looked like a track way leading out of the property and running off into the mountains. Several days later, my grandmother saw Captain again, marking his territory by the rubbing up against a tree in their yard and scratching the bark. He had several cuts across his muzzle, was missing patches of fur, had some healed bite wounds on his arm, and the hole in his ear had been torn open to the point he was missing half the ear flap. But other than that, and a slight limp that went away with time, he was fine. My aunt joked and looked rather proud of himself. When he was told about the urine-like smell on the doorstep when the wolf creature was running amok, my grandfather speculated it was trying to claim the territory. Usually black bears are relatively docile, but evidently Captain took issue with the newcomer imposing on his space and became aggressive. So what my grandmother and aunt heard that one night was the bear charging while it was distracted, engaging the intruder. While the wolf-looking creature was taller, it seemed skinnier and less massive, and apparently in confrontation and threat displays that likely followed, sheer bolt won out. Apparently it decided it wasn't worth claiming the spot, and if it meant having to square off with a quarter-ton of claws and teeth for it. Captain had run the intruder off to protect his territory and coincidentally help my family. As a thank you, and so he could recover his strength quicker, my grandfather trimmed the apple trees to down on the fruit and let the bear enjoy himself without feeding him directly. Don't want to associate humans with food. Winter would be in a few months and wanted him fattened up so he could stick around for the next year, just in case. As she put it, the forest will always have a boss, and it's better to have one who's not interested in eating you. Decades have gone by, and while both my grandparents and Captain have passed, the Dogman creature never returned. There's been about 3 black bears who've moved into Captain's place since, and each has grown about as big as he was. Thankfully, that seems to have been enough to ward off any large canines. Now that's pretty awesome. Can you imagine? You have a Dogman coming into your territory, and you have this big black bear that, he sees you, you see them, you guys don't bother each other. He eats all the, fruit he wants, and he defends his territory. Well, some way or another, that Dogman ambushed that bear. He was called Captain. And I guess he was down for a bit, and so the Dogman started taking out the creatures, all the food and everything that was there. But once Captain regained his strength, he came back and took over his territory again, and I think he fought off the Dogman creature because the bear, Captain, had all kinds of patches of fur missing, rest of his ear cut off. It was a mess, but he was limping, and then after a little bit, he was better. And they said that they haven't seen no more creatures of Dogman, around, and even though that Captain passed away, there's 3 new black bears that took over. So they don't have to worry about any Dogman creatures or so, trying to take over their property. Can you imagine? So this werewolf Dogman creature was eating up all the food around until he couldn't find no more food in that, direct area. So then he started to want to try to come in the house so he can try to eat, I guess, the people that were in the house. Luckily, they were armed with weapons and they didn't have to worry about it getting in. But it was a very close call. Alright, so I got one more story. And this one is going to be called Man on Train. Alright. So this guy did not post his username. So for those out there that probably know this person and his story, I hope you guys enjoy it. It's a little bit long, but here we go. He wrote, "Hey guys, good evening. So here's another one that left its mark in me. This one was a bad one for me. It almost cost me my life. It's another encounter in a weird place. It was another Friday around, I'd say, 7 p.m. I was going to meet with an ex to hang out. We were going to watch a movie to reconnect. The night started as always. I had just finished work. It was about 5:15 p.m. I had left my job and caught the 5:30 train as I had a long ride to get home. During these days, I worked 3 hours away from my home. For the first 3 stops, everything was chilled. It was a smooth ride, so far, but when I got to the 4th stop, that's when things changed. A man walked in, and from that moment he was staring at me aggressively. He had his hand in his hoodie, in his pouch on the front, and it had the shape of a gun. I was afraid because I knew that only meant one or two things. Either he was going to hurt me when there was less people, or he was going to rob me. Either way, I knew I was in danger. So after a few minutes, he got closer, and I got up and started walking through the other cars. He didn't let up. He followed me, and this was a big train. Like, you know how the train system works. This guy, he followed me through every single car. I was terrified and confused because nobody moved a muscle. Like they would see me traversing fast, but no one cared. Like they just literally looked past the fact that I was being followed and stalked. Finally, I got to the end and I had nowhere else to move. No way to escape. This guy at this point, I was already ready to fight for my life. My whole world was about to end. He got to me. He pulled out a gun, pointed it at my face, and I heard the bullet. People began screaming, and my world blacked out. But through barely able to see, due to the trauma of this scare, I saw as people ran towards me and grabbed me, and after a few seconds, I was gone. But I woke up about maybe 1 second later, and when I finally was able to see, I was in the arms of a beautiful woman wearing an MTA uniform. She spoke to me loudly, and I then finally really woke up. There were about 7 people around me, and this beautiful woman asked me if I was okay. She said that I gave everyone a fright. As it turns out, I fainted. I had never even left the platform. Instead, when I fainted, I fell into the tracks close to them. I had hit my head hard on the ground. I had blood on my left ear. After a few minutes, with all of these incredible people who I owe my life, I was explained that someone saw me fall and ran to get help. And luckily, there were more witnesses. All these people ran to the area where I fell, and they all pulled me back onto the platform. I was so lucky that night. My ex called me shortly after, as the MTA employee called my most recent contact. And she came over as she wasn't that far away, and I was taken to the hospital in time too, because on arrival, the nurses and the doctors that rushed me into the ER explained that I was very close to suffering major brain damage, as I wanted to have had a concussion and shut down, but it doesn't end here. As I saw this guy 2 more times on this night and the other time later in my life. As I was laying in the emergency room, behind these very dark, long curtains, a man showed up, the same one from the train. And he stared at me again, but this time he actually spoke too. He spoke to me, and in a clear voice he said, "I'm sorry." Then just vanished a second later. So now that I had a better understanding about what just occurred, the man next to me, behind the other curtain, went into cardiac arrest and died. I was the one who called out to the nurses with barely any strength, but it was already too late. And well, here's the truly scary part. The man who died, his name was Tony. He was 23, and he died in the station that I fainted in. He was the same guy who chased me, and he died tragically due to an attempted robbery gone wrong, as the assailants that attacked him shot him dead when he tried to defend himself. The only reason why I knew this is because my ex, the same one who rushed me to the hospital in the ambulance, told me that Tony was her sister's ex, who had disappeared for a long time, and that he was the one who died next to me. Her sister called her and told her that the hospital called her too. So there you go. It's one of the most frightening experiences. And to this day, I think about this guy that I don't even really know, because like I said, I've seen him 3 times in my life, but that isn't from a whole other experience. Thank you as always for taking time to read my experiences. And I always say, I accept all kinds of skepticism. It doesn't bother me because I know what I've been through. Well, that was an awesome story as well. So this guy was seeing, as soon as he got into this train, he was seeing this guy that looked like he was going to rob him or murder him, with his hand in his hoodie pocket with a hood over his head, what looked like the shape of a gun. And he was feeling scared, so he would move to each cart, and as he's doing it, this guy, who looks like a robber or a killer, is moving aggressively towards him and getting closer to him, but nobody around him is taking time to notice, like, hey, I need help. So as he finally gets to the end of the cart, he has nowhere to go. The guy raises the gun, and all of a sudden you hear a bullet, and he blacks out. He wakes up to falling and fainting. He never got shot. He fell and fainted, and people were like, yeah, you almost had a concussion and brain damage, after they rushed him to the hospital to find all that out. And come to find out, there was a guy named Tony who died in that exact place on the train in the same manner, and it was related to him through his sister, a boyfriend. That's just so crazy. Well, guys, that's my stories. That's the 3-story mashup. So I hope you guys enjoyed it. I should be having another eyewitness coming on Wednesday, Thursday, or Thursday and Friday. So thank you guys for watching, and I hope you enjoy the rest of your evening. See you guys later.